Welcome to the Hour of Empowerment. Today we have a discussion on democracy. As you may remember, we have been discussing about the definition of democracy, the benefits we may enjoy as we operate and live in a democracy, the challenges democracy is facing, and the system of governance and the types of democracy in the world. Today we're going to continue our discussion on democracy. We have two great scholars. First, I would like to introduce Professor David Shinn. He has been teaching in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University since 2001. He served for 37 years in the United States Foreign Affairs with assignments at embassies in Lebanon, Kenya, Tanzania, Mauritania, Cameroon, Sudan, and as ambassador of Burkina Faso and Ethiopia. He is the author of Historical Dictionary of Ethiopia and China and Africa, A Century of Engagement. Professor Shinn has a PhD in political science from George Washington University, and he blogs at davidshin.blogspot.com. We have also Professor Getachew Metaferia via Skype. Professor Getachew is a professor of political science at Morgan State University. He has written 2 books on Adwa and the history and diplomacy between Ethiopia and the United States. Professor Shinn, I'm so much excited to meet you again. We met in 1998 when you were the ambassador of the United States to Ethiopia. Now we are in 2014 and we are discussing about democracy. I'm so much excited to meet you again.
Well, it's my pleasure to be with you again, Asagi. That was a long time ago, and my hair has turned gray, but yours has not.
That's interesting. Professor Getachew, I'm also excited to have you again because last time we were talking about the passing of Mandela and we discussed the tie between Mandela and Ethiopia. Today we're going to discuss about democracy, and I'm excited you to be part of this discussion.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you.
Now, as a background, let's talk about freedom and democracy. It seems there is a direct relationship between freedom and democracy. Can we conclude that if there is no freedom, there is no democracy?
I think it's fair to say that if there is no freedom, then there, in fact, is no democracy. Unfortunately, the world is much messier than that, and what you have in the vast majority of countries is some freedom and some democracy, or some sort of formula that involves both of those components. So I would agree with your assumption, with your statement, but there are very, very few countries that have no freedom. Most have some freedom.
Okay, I will come up with some statistics. Before that, I would like to hear the opinion of Professor Getachew. Professor Getachew, what do you think?
Yes, there is this liberal view which says that if there is freedom, there is democracy. Yes, in most cases, we assume that wherever there is freedom, there will be democracy, and democracy will flourish. But of late, what we see is that some countries don't have democracy, and they don't have freedom as well. But in another way, there's also a mixed bag, where there is a degree of freedom, but at the same time, in most cases, the essence of democracy, the essence of equality, the essence of elections, and all of these are lacking, but the people feel that there is freedom, and the leaders also think that there is freedom, and sometimes we don't have to worry about democracy.
Now, I have a statistics from Freedom House, and they recently reported that only 40% of today's population is actually free. That means 60% of today's population is not free. So if we conclude that if there is no freedom, there is no democracy, that means almost 60% of today's population is deprived of democracy. Isn't it worrisome for you? And why local and international stakeholders are comfortable with this reality?
Well, it is a worrisome statistic. I think it does bear a little bit of elaboration. That same Freedom House report, which came out this year, also pointed out that 45% of the countries of the world are free, which means 55% are not free. Now, that isn't much better than 40% of the population, but it's a little bit better than 40%. The bigger issue, I think, is you're using here Freedom House's definition of what is free, what is partly free, and what is not free. And that is, to some extent, an arbitrary definition. There will be countries in the not free category that will have some small elements of freedom. But the way that Freedom House defines it, it puts them categorically in one of three categories. So there's some room for fuzziness here, and particularly when you get countries that are near the margins of somewhere between not free and partly free, for example, or between partly free and free. So it's not quite as black and white as perhaps Freedom House would suggest.
Yeah, you're right. According to the report I have, 35% of the population is partly free, and 25% absolutely not free. So yes, when we categorize them into three, there are free countries, there are partly free, and there are no free zone countries.
But even in the no not free area, it's just that those countries don't make the cut at all into partly free, and there may be a few elements. You know, even in a country, I don't know where they have Cuba placed in this, probably as not free.
Not free, yeah.
But you know, Cuba will have some elements where there are elements of some kinds of freedom. So it's a little bit of an arbitrary definition.
Professor, do you have something to say about that?
Yes. David's voice is vibrates. It's not clear for me. So anyway, hopefully we'll fix that. The statistics that talks about 40% free and 60% are not free. Even those countries where at one time there was freedom, some of these countries are backsliding. There is a semblance of freedom, but the mass actually are not free. So those 40%, actually the number is declining, and some of them are joining the 60% who are not free. So this whole notion of free and democracy is very questionable, simply because countries are going forward and coming back, going back, and so they are vacillating between freedom and no freedom at all. So it is a perplexing issue. Things are not clear. Those countries who were free last year today might not be free, because we do have states, or we do have leaders basically who muzzle freedom, and there are people who are uprising to assert their freedom. So these are some of the perplexing issues. So that's the situation.
Aside of the Freedom House's specific category of free, not free, partly free, now we can conclude that the majority of the population, today's population, is not free, and they're not enjoying their freedom. In that case, the question I have is, why are we comfortable with these statistics?
I'm not sure that anyone is comfortable with it, but again, keep in mind that even according to the Freedom House designation, it's a combination of not free and partly free that constitutes the majority. So it's not that a majority is, quote, not free. It's either partly free or not free. Yeah. Nevertheless, this is not an acceptable situation, obviously, and I'm not sure that the democratic countries of the world do accept it. I think they try in their own way to improve the situation. But as Professor Getachew has said, there has also been some backsliding. According to the Freedom House information, particularly in the last 8 years, And this is both globally and in Africa, where there has been some backsliding.
Let's come to the discussion about democracy and prosperity. It seems that there is a direct correlation between prosperity and democracy and stability. And when we look at countries that are wealthy, we could be able to see that they are enjoying democracy and also stability. Now, the question is, can countries ignore or undermine democracy and still achieve development, prosperity, and stability?
I think generally speaking, you do have those two concepts going hand in hand. I think prosperity, economic prosperity, does encourage democracy, and vice versa, democracy encourages economic prosperity. It gets a little messier when you start looking at some perhaps outlying situations. Take a country like Equatorial Guinea, which is very wealthy in terms of its gross national product because it has so much oil and so few people, but that wealth is not spread around the country, so the individual person in Equatorial Guinea is not wealthy, but the country is really quite wealthy. And there are other examples like that, and yet clearly democracy has a long way to go in a country like Equatorial Guinea. So I think one, again, has to be a little careful about how you define terms, but generally I would agree prosperity goes hand in hand with democracy.
No, that's true because, yes, as you say, there are some countries which are very wealthy, but they are not democratic. So we can't create a direct correlation between prosperity and democracy, but the majority of the wealthy countries are experiencing democracy and stability. And my question is, can countries ignore democracy and achieve development and democracy? Professor Getachew, do you have something to say on that?
Yes, we normally equate democracy with prosperity. But we also know that there are some countries who are prosperous as far as gross national product and other quantifiable things are concerned. But basically they don't have democracy. So there is this problem where we associate democracy with prosperity, but there are countries who are prosperous but they don't have democracy at all, and the people cannot have their own freedom. They don't have any liberty, but they are under totalitarian, authoritarian regimes. So these authoritarian or totalitarian regimes ensure that there is growth, there is development, there is prosperity, but at the cost of democracy. So these are some of the sticky issues that we face today. Historically, democracy is associated with prosperity, but there are prosperous countries who are not democratic at all and not at all.
Yes, I agree. And my concern was that some countries, they say that, for example, in the case of Ethiopia, they assume that if we focus on development and work hard, we can really make the country prosperous or make the country stable. So that's why I brought this question, whether it is possible to undermine democracy for a while and focus on development, and at the end of the day, achieve democracy or development and stability. That's why I brought this question.
The whole notion is development. Development for what? And development for whom? Is development for a minority segment of the society, or is development for the greater mass? In the case of Ethiopia, we say that there is development per capita increasing, but you talk to the people and they have not seen development, and development is something that is remote, and they have not witnessed it. So development actually is contained in the circle of few people, and the majority of the society, the majority of the people have not developed. Economically, there is abject poverty, for example, in Ethiopia, whereas the statistics tells us that there is development. So there is a farce here. There is no truth to it, but the majority of the people are still wallowing in poverty, illiteracy, and generally human rights abuses. So in that sense, we cannot basically say that development will bring about democracy.
Let's talk about End of History. The author of End of History and The Last Man, Francis Fukuyama, he talked about the two versions of End of History. In that dialogue, he talked about the Hegel's version of End of History, which is a liberal state, and Karl Marx's version of End of History, which is a communist state. Now the question is, who is right? I mean, it looks like obvious to me. I would love to hear your opinion, but as far as I'm concerned, it looks like Hegel was right, because the majority of the countries are now trying to pursue liberal democracy than socialism, or they are not aspiring to become communist states, except few countries like North Korea, China, Cuba, or Venezuela. Other than that, the majority of the countries look like pursuing toward this liberal state. But where we are right now is the question, how far are we from that end of Hegelian end of history?
Let me back up just a moment with Francis Fukuyama's essay, which came out in 1989 in an American journal. He subsequently wrote a book that got into it in much greater depth. I think that his choice of words for the title was most unfortunate, the end of history. It's an oxymoron. There is no end of history. History continues to roll on, whether you like it or not. And he didn't really mean that. If you read the article, he's really talking about two concepts, whether Western liberal democracy will be the ultimate goal of the vast majority of governments in the world, or will some other form, Marxism, Leninism, or something else. And he concludes, no, it will be Western liberal democracy. To that extent, in a very general way, I would agree with him. I think that the very basic concepts of Western liberal democracy 200 years from now or 300 years from now will be far more predominant than will any other theory or philosophy that either has been tried in the past or will be thought of in the future. But having said that, we have to be very careful about how we're defining Western liberal democracy. You have an American version, which is really quite different in many respects from the Scandinavian version. So to suggest that all of this Western liberal democracy is the same thing is just not true. And not only that, in the United States, and I assume in the Scandinavian countries, and everywhere else, there are constant changes to it. Always something new coming along, like women being allowed to vote, for example, or the way you treat the LGBT community, which is radically different than when I was growing up as a young person. And this is going to continue to be the case. Technology is going to have an impact upon how you deal with politics, how you deal with development, economics. So the idea that this is a straight line going somewhere is nonsense. And I don't think that Fukuyama even suggested that. He said there would be setbacks to Western liberal democracy. There will be periods when it doesn't progress like it should. But the ultimate end would be in the favor of Western liberal democracy, at least the basic precepts of it.
Yeah, I mean, his argument, I mean, he explained the controversial issue of end of history. He talked about how he doesn't mean that end of history in its literal meaning. He was saying that the events, the major events end this way. So he suggested that it may end as a liberal state or it may end as a communist state. The question I have is that if the trend shows that the majority of the countries in this world are pursuing some form of liberal democracy, I don't mean that the United States style of liberal democracy, because in the Europe, the dominant democratic forces are social democrats. Of course, they share some elements from the United States liberal democracy, but they have some common elements they share. So when we talk about liberal state in the future, I don't think that we're talking about, or Fukuyama was not talking about the liberal state like the United States or some other liberal state, but we may have some forms of liberal states in the majority of the countries, let's say 20 years from now, or 30 years from now, or 100 years from now.
No, I think that's correct, and I think that is what he was saying. I'm just saying that I think his choice of titles was most unfortunate, because even that is not the end of history, because it's constantly changing and constantly adapting.
Yeah, I agree. Professor Getachew, do you want to say
yes, what Fukuyama talked about is the process of development. A country will develop according to Hegel, and the last stage of this development will be liberalism or liberal democracy. And according to Marx, starting from the different stages of development, it will end up with the success of communism. But just like Ambassador said, history is not linear. It goes back and forth. And actually, I also question the premise of Fukuyama. There is no end to history. One stage will lead to another, just like the Marxian concept of development, whereby one will lead to the other. So there is no end of history. One will lead to the other. Sometimes we go back. Sometimes we go forward. So there is no as such end of history. History continues in different forms and in different shapes.
That's great. Let's talk about globalization and technologies in relation to democracy. Are they promoters or threats to democracy? Because especially in the case of Arab Spring, democratic forces used technologies, more specifically social media, to rally themselves, to organize themselves and challenge repressive regimes. But on the other hand, we have witnessed that repressive regimes are also using technologies, more specifically spyware, to target oppositions and journalists. So the question is, who is using technology to do what, and at the end of the day, what kind of things we should expect? Because it looks like it's a paradoxical situation we are having ourselves now, because both repressive regimes and democratic forces are using technologies. On the other hand, also, globalization is bringing people together, democratic forces, and whatever happens in one country invokes another movement, democratic movement, into another country and even to another continent. So are globalization and technologies promoters of democracy or threats, or what kind of future do we have with technologies and globalization in terms of democracy?
Taking technology specifically and separating it from globalization, which is a little harder to get your arms around because it's such a huge topic. But in the case of technology, in my mind, clearly it is both a threat to democracy on the one hand, but it also promotes democracy on the other. And as you indicated, you have social media being used in order to mobilize people to support democratic ideas. That clearly is one method where it can be a promoter of democracy. On the other hand, there are cases where governments and private companies and individuals, for all I know, who use, say, spyware and use it sometimes for nefarious purposes. We most often charge authoritarian governments with doing that. But I mean, we've had a little issue in the United States of late with using techniques to monitor activities or phone calls of people. The goal, in my view, was not to target human rights activists or journalists or the ordinary American. It was to try to deal with terrorism and counter it. But whenever you have a program that's that massive, there probably are going to be a few abuses that get into it. So here we claim to be the world's biggest democracy, and sometimes we have some problems of our own that we need to be careful about.
Professor Getachew?
Yes, technology is quite a marvelous thing. It has brought people together, cut distances, and so promoted interdependence between states and individuals. And this technology is also used in bringing about changes. in bringing about changes, sharing ideas, and helping people get empowered. When they have technology, they are empowered. They know about other societies, and then they can broaden their horizon. But unfortunately, some governments and some agencies are abusing technology to spy on others, to make others feel insecure. So technology is just like a dagger, a knife. It can kill you or it can cure you. A doctor can use a knife to cure you, operating on you, or somebody can use to kill somebody. So technology has two aspects, the good aspect of it and the bad aspect of it. There are bad people, bad segments of society who abuse technology, who steal data, who basically get into the privacy of the individuals. So it has become a double-edged situation where technology is very advantageous. It promotes development, brings societies together, but at the same time there are certain segments who abuse technology in order to ensure their greatness and their survival.
Let's talk about the Arab Spring. Is it over before it spreads to the sub-Saharan African countries or to the west, to the east? If it is over, what happened?
Well, we were talking earlier about the end of history, and I suggested that's an oxymoron. To some extent, the Arab Spring is an oxymoron also that has been sort of perpetrated on the public by the media. If you really think about it, how many countries in the Arab world underwent the Arab Spring? Not very many. Egypt, Libya, I guess, Tunisia, Syria, maybe. Lebanon, I'm not even sure qualifies for the category. I'm not sure that they've really had an Arab Spring. Or if they did, it was one of the shortest springs on record. The point is that I think much more has been made of the Arab Spring in the Arab world than it merits, and a lot of the original progress that one saw in the so-called Arab Spring has already dissipated, and there have been setbacks. Tunisia is the one standout. I'm very optimistic at the moment about Tunisia, but if you look at what's going on in Libya today, you just have to almost cry. It's become a tribal society again. The situation in Egypt is most disappointing, and goodness knows Syria is just an unmitigated disaster. So, in effect, it has not really much gotten beyond where it started, which was Tunisia, and it certainly has not impacted sub-Saharan Africa.
Do you agree, Professor?
Yes, let me give a couple of points. Sub-Saharan African countries had their spring as well, uprisings. That was after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, 1991 or so, which is also called the second independence of Africa. The first was from the colonial rulers, and the second one in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, where there was the democratic uprising, where they got rid of big men of Africa, the imperial presidents of Africa, and a new democracy emerged, which President Clinton called Renaissance African leaders emerged. So we had our own spring as well. Talking about the Arab Spring, the major caveat of this Arab Spring is that when you have a revolution, unfortunately, the dictators do not build institutions. They build themselves, but no institutions. So when they fall, the society will crumble with them. Look at Egypt. The only success story is Tunisia, where it started, and Tunisia has also a strong, history. The founding father of Tunisia, he educated the people. He said that he cannot talk with illiterate people. So he invested on education. So that education really helped today for the Tunisians to be aware of what is going on. And then they have gone through the revolution, changed government, and even an Islamic party came to power, elected a moderate party. So that's the situation. In Egypt, on the other hand, because the dictator did not build an institution but built himself and corruption and all of this, then the Arab Spring, the Egyptian Spring could not take roots. That's one of the major problems that we face.
So, let me just comment. I think that Professor Getachew made a very good point that sub-Saharan Africa did, in a sense, have its own Arab Spring before the Arabs had their Arab Spring. And if you look at the sort of the high watermark for democracy in sub-Saharan Africa, it was the first half of the 1990s. That was the time when you had more either democratic or reasonably democratic governments than you've had before or since. And if you really want to talk about Arab Springs, you have to go back to 1986 in Sudan, which was a partly Arab country, which had its Arab Spring long before they happened in North Africa and the Middle East.
So now the Arab Spring is over. What about the future prognosis of the Arab Spring? Do we expect some form of Arab Spring kind of style of democratic movement in the rest of the world, or it's over?
I don't think it's over, but I think that this is the period after the Arab Spring has been a real setback, and it may postpone true development of democracy in some of these countries for a number of years, which is unfortunate. But to say that it's over, no, I don't think so.
Can I comment on that, please?
Yeah, sure.
The point raised by Ambassador is excellent. The Arab Spring is not going to die. In most societies, they do have the same fundamental problems that the Maghreb countries faced. Unemployment, corruption, dictators, the educated people not finding jobs, sense of alienation. That is not confined to the Maghreb or to the Arab countries in North Africa. That's basically universal. Sub-Saharan African countries are facing the same thing. So most countries are sitting on a time bomb. The issue that is raised by the Arab Spring is more or less universal and is in other parts of Africa as well. As long as these situations are not solved, we do have abject poverty, we do have unemployment, hopelessness, alienation, then we do have potential uprising all over.
Let's talk about democracy in Africa. Do we have a role model African country which is relatively democratic, which can be used as a model to the rest of African countries?
Absolutely. I think not one, but I think there are several that I would identify. Senegal, I think, would qualify. Botswana is a good example. Namibia. Ghana is getting very close to that stage if it's not already there. Even little Benin, which has had terrible earlier history, but has been doing quite well in the last 10, 15 years. And then you go to the small island states, Cape Verde, Mauritius. They're not perhaps applicable to the mainland so much because they're very small and their societies are so different. South Africa even has, in its own way, I think something to offer other countries in Africa by way of democratization. So on the list, it's not a long list, but it's a fairly impressive list.
Professor Getachew?
Yes, Ambassador Shinn put in a very good way. There are a lot of emerging democracies in Africa. Botswana is a good example. Again, Botswana is about 6 million people. But they do have also a problem, by the way, and it's part of the wealth as a result of diamond. The Bushmen, for example, say that they claim and not claim. They say that they complain that they are uprooted so that the land will be taken by corporations that do the mining. So there is some problem. There is no country, so-called democratic, that doesn't have any problem. But the situation is even in those countries. You mentioned about South Africa, for example. Yes, when Mandela was there, when he came to power, and this reconciliation and all of this. That was the beauty of democracy. But again, today, South Africa is faced with, just like other countries, with corruption and unemployment and gender inequalities and all of this. So in every society, there is no democracy that is complete. So the problem is that they have succeeded in one aspect, maybe they have lacked in another, or they don't have anything in another sense. So there is no complete democracy, but every country is thriving and trying to achieve democracy. Of course, most African countries are better off than they were 30 or 40 years ago. But again, hopefully, this success story will continue, and hopefully some of these countries also will resolve some of their fundamental and basic problems.
You talked about the stumbling blocks that are denying many countries to have democratic governance. What are, in your opinion, the major challenges that deny many Africans their democratic rights?
Well, first and foremost, in Africa, this applies to other parts of the world, but it's a bigger problem in Africa than I think it is anywhere else in the world, and that's a free press, free and independent press that exists in relatively few African countries. Even in some of those that I consider to be quite democratic, they have a long ways to go yet in terms of a truly free press. Other issues that would be of concern would be an independent a truly independent judiciary. The electoral process obviously has to be as flawless as possible, and we all know that there are many elections in Africa where elections are still flawed to some extent. The other major category I would list would be the development of civil society organizations, which covers all kinds of groups. And in some African countries, they're actually quite strong. In others, in fact, most, they're not very strong. And I think the building up of civil society is absolutely critical.
Professor?
Well, well said, Ambassador Shinn. But let me say a couple of things. As far as the challenges to democracy is concerned in African countries, these challenges come from two spheres, internal and external. Internally, just like well articulated by Ambassador, separation of power, absence of free press, human rights abuses, dictators, corruption, and all of these are eating up African societies, and basically these are a challenge. The other challenge comes from outside, external forces, external countries, for example, or corporations in collaboration with corrupt leaders. They are also subjugating and oppressing countries, whether they like it or not, directly or indirectly. The whole notion of land grab is one aspect of it. So the challenge to African societies, African people, is coming from within their own dumb leaders and the lack of institution, the lack of free press and all of these human rights abuses. And then in collaboration with some of these leaders, external forces are also suppressing and alienating the mass, the poor people. And that's what we see in some of these countries, like in Ethiopia, for example, with whole notion of land grab, where people basically are uprooted from their land and they are put somewhere in a barren land. So these are some of the challenges to democracy, internal as well as external forces.
You mentioned about internal and external factors. Considering the internal factors, can we put some blame on us, on the people? Because many people are reluctant to participate in the democratization process of their countries. So is there any blame we should take also?
You're talking about the average person?
The average person.
Not a government official?
Not a government.
Yeah, to some extent, people do have to stand up for what they believe, and in some cases, in some countries, they're willing to do that, and others, they're less willing. In some cases, it's dangerous to do that, so I can understand why people are reluctant. But the other issue is corruption. Corruption does not just apply to government officials. Corruption is a process that becomes endemic in society, all the way down to people who have nothing to do with government. And if people start putting up with corruption, boy, it's very hard to stamp it out, particularly if it goes down to the grassroots level.
Okay, let's talk about developmental democracy.
Can I say a few words on what the ambassador said? The poverty, in Africa, politics is not a cup of tea for most people. They live from hand to mouth because of poverty. They are not empowered. They don't have the knowledge. And there's also this sense of fear, from the government to the state. Mind you, state and society live in different worlds. The state and the society are drifting apart. So all of these are not encouraging people to participate. They live in fear. They are poor. They want to find out where they're going to get their next bread. So this poverty is also working against the African mass in collaboration with dictators who are also subjugating their own people. So these are some of the things, some of the issues that are not encouraging people to participate in political issues and political movements.
Coming to the external factors, what about the war against terror? Because it looks like since September 11, the developed countries and democracies, they're not pushing that far to make repressive regimes accountable, because the focus is now on terror. And if some countries like Ethiopia, for example, as far as they align with the war against terror, they're not pushed externally by developed democracy or multinational institutions. Don't you think that is also a setback to democracy?
Well, certainly, if you're taking the foreign policy of the United States, particularly, and looking at the degree to which it makes decisions based on counterterrorism versus the degree to which it makes decisions based on support for democratization, that presents a real challenge, because these are often in conflict with each other, and in quite a number of countries. So yes, it presents a problem, and the government has to make some choices, and sometimes they're not very pretty choices, but that's the way the world is, and realpolitik, and it's weighing the good, the bad, and the indifferent, and that's what happens.
Anything to add, Professor?
Yeah, this whole notion of war and terror is also something that came specifically after 9/11 in the United States. It's just like, it reminds me of the Cold War period, when some countries basically say that they are a bulwark against communism, and then they get support from Western countries, or they say they have adopted socialism, and then they get support from the Soviet Union of that time. But now some of these countries are claiming to fight terrorism, while some of these leaders actually are terrorizing their own people. And this war and terror is also bringing about insecurity in the people. So when you challenge a government, when a political party challenges, when some people or journalists rise or question the state, they will be associated with terrorism. It's just like in the United States in the 1950s with the McCarthy period, where whenever you challenge the state, basically you will be dubbed as a communist, the fear of the raid. And so they are playing on the psyche of the people by simply saying that when you challenge them, even when you ask some modest question, you will be associated with terrorism. So that has become bringing about insecurity in the life of the people.
I mean, is it not possible to do both, which means still fight terrorism and at the same time also try to help democratic forces to gain their democratic rights?
Well, I think that's what the United States tries to do, but you still reach a point where the government with which you are interacting has certain limits that it's going to place upon the amount of pressure that it will accept. And then the United States has to weigh the amount of pressure they put against what they are getting in return for the other issue, that is counterterrorism. So it's just a question of doing as much as you can and pushing as far as you think you can go without pushing the other government off the other side and then losing the support on counterterrorism.
Yeah, sure.
This so-called war on terror has also given a pass mark for some of the leaders, simply because by saying that they are fighting terrorism, aligning with the United States or with other countries, some of those countries might be undemocratic, just like in the Cold War period, let us say about DRC, Congo at that time. Mobutu basically claimed to fight communism and is a dictator, but the United States and the Western countries kept on supporting him. And today also some of the dictators, the United States and other countries do not care less about how these leaders deal with their own people, as long as they identify with a superpower to fight this so-called war on terror. So that's also creating some kind of problem for most of the people. So any kind of undemocratic behavior or undemocratic situation by a leader is forgiven by the West, simply because they are allies in fighting terrorism. So this has become another concerning issue for most of the people and most scholars who come from the third world countries.
Let's talk about developmental democracy. I hope you heard about it. The ruling party in Ethiopia, they said that they dropped revolutionary democracy. Now they pursue developmental democracy. Revolutionary democracy by itself is not very clear. I mean, it is a variant of democratic socialism. Revolutionary democracy embraces leftist or socialistic ideologies. Of course, there are some liberal or free market elements. Now, they have added with another concept, which is developmental democracy, but they didn't explain about it. So, what is developmental democracy, and what is the difference between revolutionary democracy and developmental democracy?
Well, I think we're all doing a certain amount of guessing here. It's my understanding that the use of the term developmental democracy did not really even appear from a senior EPRDF official until earlier this year, when Barakat Simone, who has a senior position in the government, indicated that developmental democracy had replaced revolutionary democracy. I'm not aware that there has been any extensive discussion of it since that remark. That does raise the question, is this the official policy? And if so, are we going to get more of a definition about it in the coming months? And perhaps we will. It's interesting if you go back and look at some of Barakat Simone's earlier statements. About 4 years ago, he was using the term developmental journalism. Now, I'm not sure what developmental journalism is. He did actually define it to some extent back then, but maybe he just likes that term, and maybe this is not yet sort of the official policy of Ethiopia. But I'm assuming he knows of what he speaks. And I think, more importantly, if one goes back and looks at revolutionary democracy, it has changed enormously over time. It really started out as being something akin to Albanian communism. If you go back into the days of the TPLF before the EPRDF came into power in Ethiopia, well, even by 1991, it had left the Albanian communism phase and had become something quite different. And it's taken on an economic model which has aspects, actually, of free market economics, which is far distant from Albanian communism. And it's evolved since then. In fact, it seems to evolve every couple of years or so. What I suspect is going on is that developmental democracy is just one more sort of evolution in the discussion of revolutionary democracy. Perhaps it will officially have a new name now, but even if you go back at least as early as 2006, perhaps earlier, the EPRDF was talking regularly about the developmental state, not developmental democracy, but developmental state. And that suggests to me that this whole concept of development has been critical to the concept of revolutionary democracy, going back probably 10 years, if not longer. The origin of the term, I'm not sure where it comes from. It is interesting that Professor Richard Sklar at UCLA back in 1987 did a very lengthy article for a scholarly journal called Developmental Democracy. And I doubt that that's where where the term comes from. I suspect it originated internally inside Ethiopia, and perhaps even began with Meles Zenawi himself, who was clearly very interested in this topic. But it's still a bit of a puzzle to me as to what it is, and I'm waiting to see how the EPRDF defines it.
Professor, do you find it surprising that the government just made a shift to developmental democracy? Is it real or propaganda?
First of all, if we look into some of these concepts of developmental democracy and developmental state, this is, as usual, it is state intervention in the democratic, in the development life of a country. And some of the leaders, basically what Plato used, Plato called philosopher kings, who are wisdom lovers. They try to concoct some idea, philosophy, and try to impose on the people, maybe without any discussion or any discourse. But again, if we look into some concept of this developmental state, which Ethiopia is also following, it says that there is going to be some collaboration between the rural sector and the urban and the labor coalition. If you look in the Ethiopian case, when you talk about the rural areas, the rural people, they don't have land. They are landless. And some of them are being even marginalized because of these land grabbers. So how can you collaborate with this? So it's very ironic that this concept is trying to take roots now. I don't know if it's going to improve the life of the people, if it's going to fight poverty. Actually, it's going to make sure that the existing political party, some states, for example, they call themselves developmental state like Japan, which had been there for 50 years, a coalition of different political parties. In the Ethiopian case, there is no coalition between different political parties. So it's going to ensure the hegemony and the continuing power of the existing political party or the incumbent political party. So these are some of the ambivalent things that we are looking into when we dissect, when we analyze. There will be a lot of questionable things.
Yeah, both of you said that it may not be a major change. It's just a name change. I agree with that because they are still practicing ethnic politics, and they have ethnic-based political parties and ethnic federalism, the main elements of revolutionary democracy. So as far as the main elements, the factors of revolutionary democracy there, I don't see that they make a shift to developmental democracy without any major change.
What will be interesting is whether the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Party renames itself the Ethiopian People's Developmental Party.
Maybe that's next, maybe, I don't know, next time, maybe. Yeah, maybe. But do you know any country that practices developmental democracy in the past or now?
I'm not aware of a country that uses that specific terminology. There is a lot of discussion about the developmental state, and that may be essentially the same thing. I'm not sure. But no, I'm not aware. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I mean, it simply may be a lacuna in my own information.
I try to research in Google, but I don't find any country practicing developmental democracy right now. Professor, do you know any country that practices developmental democracy?
For example, the Asian tigers, who developed, although they keep authoritarian regime, authoritarian state, but their economy has developed, the Asian tigers, now including even maybe India and China. So this might be in the family of the developmental state, although they don't call it that way.
Even conceivably South Korea and Taiwan, which Ethiopia always, or the EPRDF frequently will single out as a model that it's trying to emulate.
Let's conclude our discussion. What should be the roles of individuals, community organizations, local, regional, and continental and international organizations in bringing democracy to Africa, in developing democracy in Africa?
I'm not sure I have anything terribly original to respond to in that question. I've been in this business, was in it for 37 years, mainly dealing with Africa. I've seen all of these organizations try to do what they can do in order to improve the situation. On the margins, you sometimes see progress, but it's usually always on the margins. Very rarely do you see really huge change in a country on the basis of external involvement. And other than civil society and those international organizations that are currently engaged in promoting democracy, the external groups like the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, continuing to do what they're doing, I'm not sure I have any brilliant ideas. Maybe I've just gotten too tired over the years.
What about, Professor, do you have any suggestions about the roles different stakeholders?
Let me say a couple of things. One is in regard to the individuals, for example, that the role of the individual basically is to empower themselves, to be very active, to question the status quo, and when they see positive things, again, support any government that is trying to fight poverty and bring about social equality. Of course, the governments have to do a lot of things. Civil society, as mentioned, have to exist and to operate. In the United States, for example, civil societies are very important. When Tocqueville came here in the United States about 180 years ago, I assume, he said, Americans do have a propensity to organize themselves. So organization is core of democracy. So civil organization, freedom of the press, so empowering women. And in addition to this also, stop this hemorrhaging of drain, money and resources invested on educating people, and those people do not find freedom, they don't find security, so they leave the countries. Very dangerous. Countries need to do something about it. And I do have a message for the international community, especially states. Donor countries basically are spawning dictators. If they feel that are advancing their national interests, they simply give money, whereas the society is not benefiting. I think there is a turnover on. I think I have a problem with my. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you, but...
okay. So I'm sorry. So these donor states, donor countries also have to challenge states. They have to. They are requested to side with the people and not always with the states. Of course, Ambassador, he's a career diplomat, who will say that how can we reach the state? I mean, the people. We have first to deal with the state. This is state-to-state communications that we have. Yes, that's true. But donor states have really to make sure that their money is spent on the areas where the people will benefit. So these are some of my messages that I have. Thank you.
I really appreciate both of you. I know you are very busy, but you decided to come here and share your experience and also knowledge to our viewers. So on behalf of ISAT and our viewers, thank you very much for coming and sharing your ideas.
Thank you for inviting me to come.
Thank you very much.
Dear viewers, we have concluded our discussion on democracy. Next week, we're going to have a very new topic, which is good governance. Until I see you next week, have a wonderful time. Thank you very much for watching.